Okay, another big story this week is the Cliff Richard judgment, and I thought I'd see if I could track. This is he's been awarded £200,000 roughly, and I'd see if I track down one of the journalists who really knows a lot about these and freedom of information requests as well. I've been finding out a great deal about what the police powers are, etc. So I spoke a couple of days ago on the day of the judgment to Mark Watts, and here he answers some of my questions about what is the actual detail of this judgment, privacy judgment, because quite obviously the legal costs are massive. It's a private prosecution. It's a civil case against the BBC.
My name is Mark Watts. I'm a freelance journalist. I'm the former editor of Exero, and I'm the coordinator at the Foyer Centre. So this is the judgment in the case that Sir Cliff Richard brought against the BBC and South Yorkshire Police. And the judgment that's been handed down today by Justice Mann basically represents a huge boost for Britain's culture of secrecy. Now, we're already notorious around the world for our culture of secrecy, but that's just got a whole lot worse. And the judgment represents a big setback for freedom of expression. What this case is essentially about comes down to a balance or a battle between everyone's Article 8 rights under the European Convention on Human Rights, Article 8 being the right to privacy, and our Article 10 rights, the freedom of expression. Now, the judgment talks an awful lot about the Article 8 rights that everyone has and that Sir Cliff Richard has, but it says very, very little about our Article 10 rights. And this is a huge development of privacy law in this country, which has slowly been developing judge-made privacy law over the past few years. But this is a major step forward in that development, or step backwards, depending on which way you look at it, where Article 8 rights to privacy utterly trample over Article 10 rights to the extent that the judge, just to my mind, has really not weighed them into the balance.
Cliff Richard's quite privileged in that he's spent quite a lot of money. He's a wealthy man. Does this mean that privacy is something that really is only going to be afforded to the wealthy?
Basically, yes. In this developing law of privacy rights developed by judges in various judgments that have been handed down in this country, that's really only an option for anyone who has the resources to bring such actions. So specifically here, this was obviously a case in which the BBC had reported that Sir Cliff Richard's home had been raided in connection with an investigation into child sexual abuse. Of course, that case ultimately didn't go anywhere. A file was not even... Actually, I think a file was sent to the CPS, but no charges were brought. He had never been arrested. And the battle was over whether the BBC had the right to report that or not. In essence, the judgment says no, they didn't have the right, and indeed it was a breach of Cliff Richard's privacy to report it. It wasn't just a rather, as he put it, the judge put it, a rather sensationalist way in which the BBC reported it, such as sending up a helicopter and shooting through the window of his home. That was rather over the top. But actually what the judge is saying is put all that aside, all this extra sensationalism, as he describes it, put all that aside. He says that even simply to have reported in a very, very, as it were, almost boring way, a very flat way, that his home had been raided was in itself a breach of privacy. As I say, this is a massive blow for freedom of expression in this country. It's going to be very hard to hold power to account, not something that the media has been very successful
I mean,
at.
is it fair, though, Mark, to put somebody on the main news to discuss whether or they're actually being investigated when they may have done nothing wrong?
Well, of course, they may have done nothing wrong, and what is critically important is that reporting makes no presumption about guilt, and is indeed very careful to report the response of the person concerned. And actually, if you look back at the reports that the BBC did, it was very careful not to presume guilt, and indeed to allow Cliff Richard, his response. They were possibly a little slow in getting the response, and as I recall, it wasn't there in their very first bulletin. They produced the response about an hour later. So the question is whether it's fair to report that someone is under criminal investigation, so long as they're careful to avoid implying guilt. And I think it's a basic right to be able to report that, as long as it's being reported accurately. And actually the judge points out that the reports were accurate, it's just that he didn't like them.
What about the costs? Because Cliff Richard has spent quite a lot of money. Do we know how much on this?
Well, that's not referred to in the judgment, but I think there have been reports of Cliff Richard spending in the order, I think, between 3 and 4 million on lawyers following the BBC report. What the judgment actually does today is it made a determination that he should receive £190,000 by way of general damages, £20,000 for aggravated damages. That was specifically because the BBC had entered the story into Scoop of the Year for the RTS Awards, Royal Television Society Awards. But there's another strand, which is what's known as special damages, which are for specific things, specific effects, such as having to pay for lawyers to deal with further stories that surfaced in the media, to sort of firefight those, as well as cancelled plans to publish a new edition of his autobiography. Those special damages will add a whole load more to the bill, and then of course there'll be legal costs on top. I do think, though, that it's inevitable that the BBC will appeal. They certainly should appeal, in my view. They so far said they're considering an appeal. And actually, I can see this going all the way up the court system in our country and on to the European Court of Human Rights. And actually, I think, in the end, this case will really be won by the BBC and the European Court of Human Rights, because I just don't think judges in this country, they don't like the media very much. They certainly don't like the media doing their job at all. And as this judgment shows, for anyone who reads it, is a huge amount of weight is placed on Article 8, the right to privacy, and very, very little weight is taken into account in regard to Article 10.
The right to privacy versus freedom of expression, Gary. What do you think?
Well, I mean, I'm less concerned about, millionaire pop stars than I am about the ordinary man in the street, who actually sometimes can suffer terrible consequences for being falsely accused. And we got to bear in mind that on some offences which they're accused of, there have been lots of instances recently where people have been accused of extremely serious offences, and the evidence which would acquit them has actually been hidden by the Crown Prosecution Service because of poor disclosure. Now, basically, doesn't it add insult to injury that their name is going to be spread around, or potentially spread around, in the papers when they've done absolutely nothing wrong?
Well, yes, the name can be spread around, but then that is not... I mean, as he said there, Mark said, that the BBC haven't accused Cliff Richard of doing anything. What they're saying is there is a raid on his home, and that there may possibly at some point in the future be charges. But they're being very careful. They're also making sure that they give his point of view as well. So that is to avoid a case for defamation, libel. So they're actually staying within the law. But now they're saying that law is not enough. You're not allowed to report.
I saw that BBC coverage, and it was sensationalist. And basically, it was meant to get the message across. There's no smoke without fire. And basically, that's the danger all the time. Even if you know perfectly well that it's perfectly easy to write an article in the paper which is legal, but actually is absolutely damning and gives a completely false impression.
There have been some quite credible accusations against Cliff Richard over the years, Martin, on and off. And also, I wonder whether this particular case is maybe not just about Cliff, but about the accusations against people like Harvey Proctor and Lord Bramall, who have been interviewed by the police. And the idea really being to, even if you're wrongly or rightly accused, to make sure that there is no coverage whatsoever of that sort of investigation going on, and the possibility that somebody might be. Because, of course, one of the positive things about that, from the public's point of view, is that if there are other witnesses, they may well come forward to the police.
Yeah, I wonder if everybody would be happy if Jimmy Savile had been raided and the BBC hadn't reported it, and of course they covered up for him for years, didn't they? The other thing that occurred to me is, of course, if somebody on social media had got their phone out and taken a picture of the police doing the raid and then blogged away with, the police are raiding the Cliff Richard's home, which no doubt could easily happen, could they be prosecuted for reporting stuff that they've seen?
I saw a lawyer the other day who made a very, very valid point on this, and basically what he was actually saying is there should be an application to the court to be able to report. And I take the point that sometimes you've got people who are guilty of sexual offences, and publicising that can actually help others to come forward. I mean, and that's very important.
My view on this is basically that it's more rich and powerful people saying we don't want anything nasty written about us. It's a bit like the right to be forgotten, where you can get any former misdemeanours removed from the internet, that sort of thing. But anyway, look, one of the most important things with all this child sexual abuse stuff is accusations is whether you go to the police. And I had a chat earlier this week with a chap that he's actually doing a tour around Scotland at the moment. His name's David Scott, and he's from something called the Fresh Start Foundation, and here's his views on whether you can just simply take your accusations to the police or not.
Oh, you've got to be so careful. I mean, this is the huge difficulty. There is no general advice, but what I would say is that people have to be extremely careful. They have to not trust the authorities. They have to weigh up the risks that they're running at every stage, and they have to take responsibility for whatever they do themselves. Let me sort of illustrate this by going back to how one of the charities that we work with who have been dealing with this for years, they started off advising people to go to the police. This is the charity who deals with the ritual abuse victims. And what they were finding is that it was often young women who were trying to escape abusive situations, and they were trying to report the abuse which had happened, and they very often had children. And the first thing that would happen is the authorities would seize their children. And the second thing that would happen is the authorities would give the children to one of the people they had named as an abuser. And this happened over and over and over again. And it got so that the charity no longer advises, and they met lots of good police officers during this point who were trying to do a good job, and then saw these investigations, if they did get started in a positive way, sabotage from on high within police ranks. Officers would be reassigned, and hostile officers would come in their place, and this sort of thing. So it got to the situation that the charity now advises the people, if they're being abused, have you got somebody you trust? Have you got somewhere you can run to and you can be safe? And if the answer is yes, the advice is get the kids and go. You don't tell the authorities and you don't tell anyone else. Get the kids and go. So the first thing I would say to any survivor who's trying to decide what to do is you have to make sure that you're safe. And ultimately your safety and survival comes first. I'm afraid that my conclusion is you cannot trust the authorities. You should not trust the authorities. It's too dangerous. You could be fortunate, you could be very unfortunate, you wouldn't know.
Well, Martin, this is the experience of quite a few people over the years. One would hope that the Savile case has meant that the police can be trusted a bit more, but it's not as simple as that all the time. Well, we had did we not have an interview with the former Met officer that was dealing with John Wedger, John Wedger, if you want to look him up. He gave a pretty horrifying account of what happened to him when he tried to investigate these things, and how he was told to back off, and it was more than his job was worth, etc. And then he lost his job pursuing all of these cases. What's at the back of all this then? Well, basically, abuse of children has been going on for years and years and years, and it happens all the time. I mean, hundreds of kids in this country die every year from. Here's a key question: is this something that Britain has got that other countries don't have, or is it just that Britain is the only country that's really dealing with it at the moment? No, well, underlying all of this, if I mention the King Cora Boys' Home in Belfast, you will understand that why top-level people are protected is it's being used as blackmail by the intelligence services. They probably murdered David Kelly, and they use sexual entrapment as blackmail. That's what was happening at King Cora. Everybody in Belfast knows it. I mean, isn't it just the mafia, prostitution, organised crime?
No, it's the police and the intelligence services using, that's what MI5 were using Kincora, but various political figures went in there, had sex with underage boys, and then they were being blackmailed.
Gary,
that's what was going on.
A couple of words from you?
Well, I think that we've got to make certain that we don't get extreme on either side, because for a long time, victims and survivors were not believed at all. And then we were told, you believe everything they say, which was also wrong.
OK, time for the Murdoch News.
Got
to stop you there. Time for the Murdoch News. Thanks to our guest, Lib Dem.